Robert Bowers is one of the most hated men in modern American history. On the morning of October 27, 2018, he entered the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh with an AR-15 rifle and 3 handguns. Inside, worshippers had gathered for a peaceful Sabbath service. Within minutes, 11 people were dead. Bowers moved through the building room by room, hunting victims. Survivors later described how he shouted anti-Semitic slurs as he fired, claiming that Jews were committing genocide against his people. He shot a 97-year-old woman. He gunned down 2 brothers. He even fired on police officers responding to the scene. It was the deadliest attack on Jewish people in U.S. history. The FBI quickly declared it an act of domestic terrorism. After a brief shootout, Bowers was wounded and surrendered. In custody, he showed no remorse. He told investigators he wanted all Jews to die, and that he believed they were children of Satan. The Justice Department sought the death penalty. In 2023, after a harrowing trial and testimony from survivors, he was convicted on 63 federal charges, including hate crimes and obstruction of religious belief resulting in death. The jury sentenced him to death. He currently awaits execution at USP Terre Haute in Indiana, one of just 3 men left on federal death row, after President Biden commuted most federal death sentences in 2024. To his victims' families and much of the nation, Robert Bowers is not just a criminal. He is the embodiment of hate-fueled violence in America. And when his sentence is finally carried out, it will mark a grim chapter closing, not with justice, but with finality. Dylan Storm Roof committed one of the most shocking acts of racial violence in modern American history. On the evening of June 17, 1915, Roof entered the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, one of the oldest black churches in the United States. Inside, a Bible study group was underway. Roof joined them, sitting quietly for nearly an hour. Then, without warning, he pulled out a Glock .45 caliber pistol and opened fire. He reloaded multiple times. When it was over, 9 parishioners were dead, including a pastor, a librarian, and several elderly churchgoers. Among them was 87-year-old Susie Jackson, who was shot 11 times. The only survivor was spared so she could tell the world what happened. Roof left behind a racist manifesto. He had been radicalized online, convinced that black Americans were a threat to white society. He posted photos of himself with the Confederate flag and weapons, and declared that he wanted to start a race war. He chose the church specifically for its historical significance in the black community. Captured the next day during a traffic stop in North Carolina, Roof showed no remorse. In fact, during his federal trial, he represented himself and told the jury he had no regrets. He was convicted on 33 counts, including hate crimes resulting in death, and sentenced to death on January 11, 2017. He remains on federal death row at USP Terre Haute in Indiana. His case is frequently cited in discussions about domestic terrorism and white supremacy. Though appeals continue, his execution remains a possibility, one of the few still scheduled under the U.S. federal system. To this day, Dylan Roof stands as a chilling reminder of how ideology, when combined with hate and easy access to firearms, can lead to unimaginable horror. Dzhokhar Sarnav was just 19 years old when he helped carry out one of the worst terrorist attacks on American soil since 9/11. On April 15, 2013, during the Boston Marathon, he and his older brother Tamerlan placed 2 homemade pressure cooker bombs near the finish line. As the crowd cheered and runners crossed, the bombs exploded. 3 people were killed, including an 8-year-old boy, and more than 260 others were injured. Many lost limbs. The scene was chaotic, bloody, and horrifying. For 4 days, Boston was under lockdown. The manhunt that followed paralyzed an entire city. Surveillance footage showed the brothers calmly walking away from the bomb site. They were identified within hours. Days later, as police closed in, the brothers carjacked a vehicle and murdered a university police officer. During a shootout in the streets of Watertown, Tamerlan was killed. Dzhokhar escaped and hid in a boat behind a suburban home. He was discovered hours later, wounded and bleeding. On the walls of the boat, he had scrawled a message claiming the attack was revenge for U.S. actions in the Middle East. He surrendered without a fight. In 2015, he was convicted on all 30 federal charges, including use of a weapon of mass destruction and bombing a public place resulting in death. The jury sentenced him to death. The case went through a long legal battle. His death sentence was overturned in 2020 by a federal appeals court, citing issues with jury selection. But in 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the sentence. Today, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev sits on federal death row at the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, one of the most secure prisons in the world. His appeals continue, but many believe it is only a matter of time before justice is carried out. To much of the country, Tsarnaev is not just a terrorist. He is a symbol of how even those born and raised in America can be radicalized into violence. The Boston bombing left scars not just on its victims, but on the nation's sense of safety and peace. Byron Lewis Black has been on Tennessee's death row for over 3 decades. His case, while less nationally known than others, is one of cold calculation and devastating cruelty. On April 23, 1988, Black murdered his girlfriend, Angela Clay, and her 2 daughters, 9-year-old Latoya and 6-year-old Lakeisha, in their Nashville home. The motive? He was angry that Angela wanted to leave him. That night, Byron Black picked up a .45 caliber pistol, walked into their apartment, and executed all 3 victims in their beds while they slept. After the killings, he calmly went to work the next day, as if nothing had happened. When police arrived at the crime scene, they were met with a blood-soaked tragedy. All 3 victims had been shot in the head. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, just a quiet, deliberate mass killing behind closed doors. Black became a suspect almost immediately. He had a history of violence and drug use. During the investigation, he gave conflicting statements and eventually admitted he had been using cocaine the night of the murders. But he claimed he blacked out and couldn't remember what had happened. A jury didn't buy it. In 1989, he was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Since then, his legal team has filed multiple appeals, some claiming mental illness, others pointing to racial bias and ineffective counsel. None have succeeded in overturning his sentence. In 2023, Tennessee's Supreme Court set an execution date for August 5, 2025. If carried out, it would be one of the state's first executions in years. Byron Black is now in his 70s. He spent over half his life on death row. But for the families of Angela, Latoya, and Lakeisha, justice has been long delayed. And for Black, his bottom wasn't the night he pulled the trigger. It's the silence that followed, the years alone in a prison cell, with 3 names that won't let him go. Blaine Keith Milam was only 18 years old when he committed one of the most disturbing crimes in Texas history. On December 2, 2008, emergency responders arrived at a trailer home in Rusk County. What they found inside defied belief. Amid the filth and chaos, the battered body of 13-month-old Amora Carson, the daughter of Milam's girlfriend, lay lifeless on the floor. She had been beaten to death over the course of several hours. Her tiny body showed signs of more than 20 separate injuries. She had bite marks, broken bones. Her skull was crushed. Milam's explanation? He said the child was possessed and that they had been trying to perform an exorcism. Investigators were stunned. Milam and his girlfriend, Jessica Carson, had convinced themselves that the baby was the target of demonic forces. In court, prosecutors described the scene as a medieval torture session. There was no justification, no mercy. A forensic expert testified that Amora's injuries were consistent with someone being beaten with a hammer. Blood was found on nearly every surface of the home. It was, one detective said, the worst crime scene I've ever walked into. At trial, Milam tried to deflect blame onto Carson, but the evidence was overwhelming. In 2010, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Over the years, Milam's legal team has mounted appeals based on claims of intellectual disability and poor legal representation. His execution was postponed multiple times, in 1919, 2000, and again in 2021. But in late 2024, a new date was set. September 25, 2025. He is currently housed on Texas death row at the Polunsky unit, awaiting his sentence. To many, Blaine Millam represents the intersection of drug-fueled delusion and unthinkable violence. His bottom wasn't just the murder. It was the moment he tried to mask a brutal killing as religious salvation. A baby girl died screaming, and Texas has never forgotten her name. Corinne Martin Jackson was only 20 years old when he carried out one of the most ruthless mass murders in Ohio's modern history. The crime took place in the early hours of March 25, 1997, in a quiet Columbus neighborhood, and it would leave 4 people dead, all executed in cold blood. The motive? Drugs and money. Jackson and an accomplice lured 5 individuals to a small apartment under the guise of settling a dispute. Once inside, Jackson methodically forced them to the ground and shot each one in the back of the head, execution style. 4 of the victims died instantly. The 5th, despite being shot, survived and later testified against him. Prosecutors said it was a premeditated plan to silence anyone who might talk. But what stunned investigators wasn't just the brutality. It was the detachment. Jackson showed no emotion, no hesitation. At trial, the surviving victim described how she had to play dead while her friends were killed beside her. That testimony sealed Jackson's fate. In 1998, a jury convicted him on 4 counts of aggravated murder. He was sentenced to death. Since then, Jackson has spent over 25 years on Ohio's death row. He's filed multiple appeals, citing alleged intellectual disability and questions about trial fairness. But every court that reviewed his case upheld the conviction and the sentence. In 2023, Ohio officials set an execution date for December 10, 2025. It would be the state's first lethal injection in years, but only if the ongoing issues with execution drugs are resolved. Jackson remains incarcerated at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. His case has largely faded from national headlines, but in Ohio, he is still remembered as the young man who walked into a room and turned it into a massacre. For Corinne Jackson, the bottom came fast and cold, in a room full of gunfire, blood, and silence. Harold Wayne Nichols is one of Tennessee's most notorious and long-standing death row inmates. His crime wasn't just a murder, it was a calculated, sexually violent assault on an innocent woman, committed by a man who had already been convicted of similar attacks. On the night of September 30, 1988, 21-year-old Karen Pulley left work and never came home. She was found the next morning on a wooded path near Chattanooga, raped, beaten, and strangled. Her skull had been fractured with a concrete block. Her body had been dragged into a secluded area, as if discarded. Police connected the crime to Harold Nichols through tire tracks, blood evidence, and eventually, a confession. He admitted to following Pulley, attacking her, and then returning to the scene later to hide what he had done. What investigators didn't know at first was that Nichols had a long and chilling pattern. Prior to Karen's murder, he had been convicted twice for violent rapes, including one involving a 13-year-old girl. He had served prison time, been released, and then attacked again. This wasn't random. It was predatory. At trial, prosecutors portrayed Nichols as a serial sexual offender who had escalated to murder. The jury agreed. In 1990, he was convicted and sentenced to death. Over the next 3 decades, Nichols remained on death row, filing appeal after appeal. His lawyers claimed childhood trauma, ineffective representation, and mental health issues. Courts rejected every argument. His execution was scheduled multiple times, but each date was delayed, most recently due to a review of Tennessee's lethal injection protocols. Despite the setbacks, the state reaffirmed his sentence in 2024 and rescheduled his execution for December 11, 2025. Harold Nichols has now spent more time awaiting death than his victim ever spent alive. For the Pulley family, it's been 37 years without closure. And for Nichols, the bottom wasn't when he was caught. It was the moment a pattern of violence finally ended in murder, and the system stopped giving him second chances. John Marion Hansen's path to death row began with a drug deal and ended in a double homicide that left an Oklahoma community shattered. It was 1999 in Tulsa County, and Hansen had just been released from prison on a prior conviction. But freedom didn't last long. On the night of September 10th, Hansen and his accomplice forced their way into a residence known to be associated with drug activity. What followed was a brutal execution masked as a robbery. Inside the home, they shot and killed 27-year-old Brian Montgomery and 20-year-old Kendra Melton. Montgomery was found on the floor, shot in the head. Melton, who had reportedly tried to flee, was gunned down near the door. The home was then set on fire. When firefighters arrived, they discovered the bodies after the blaze had been extinguished. The crime scene was horrific. Smoke damage, blood splatter, shell casings, and signs of a rushed attempt to destroy evidence. Police linked Hansen to the scene through witness testimony and ballistics. But what truly sealed his fate was his own behavior. He bragged about the killings to acquaintances. He described it as business and showed no remorse. In 2001, he was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Over the next 2 decades, Hansen remained behind bars at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. His legal team pursued appeals based on mental illness and ineffective counsel, but none of those efforts succeeded. In April 2025, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals set his execution date for June 12, 2025. Unless a last-minute stay is granted, John Hansen will be executed by lethal injection. To many in Oklahoma, Hansen's name evokes a case that never made national headlines, but never needed to. It was the kind of murder that felt personal, ugly, senseless. His bottom wasn't just a prison cell. It was the moment he stopped being a criminal and became a killer. And in the eyes of the court, that made all the difference. Thomas Overton Gudinas committed a crime that shocked Orlando in the mid-1990s, not just because of its brutality, but because of how quickly a night of partying turned into a calculated, lethal assault. His name would become synonymous with predatory violence. And nearly 30 years later, he remains on death row, awaiting execution. On March 21, 1994, 23-year-old Thomas Gudinas left a downtown Orlando nightclub in the early hours of the morning. Witnesses say he was high on drugs and drinking heavily. That night, he targeted a woman named Lisa Beery, a 23-year-old college student who had also been out with friends. Security cameras later captured Gudinas following Beery to a nearby parking garage. There, prosecutors say he forced her into her car at gunpoint and drove her to an abandoned construction site. What happened next was described by investigators as pure evil. Beery was beaten, raped, and then shot once in the head. Her body was discovered 2 days later by construction workers. The scene showed signs of a prolonged struggle. It wasn't just a random attack. It was deliberate, violent, and personal. Police traced the crime back to Gudinas within days. He had left behind a trail of evidence: Beery's car keys, his own fingerprints, and later, a confession. He showed no emotion. He never apologized. In court, his attorneys argued that Gudinas had suffered brain damage from years of drug abuse. But the jury was unmoved. The facts were too strong, the violence too extreme. He was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery. In 1995, he was sentenced to death. Since then, Gudinas has exhausted nearly every legal option. His appeals have spanned decades, citing ineffective counsel, intellectual disability, and improper jury instructions. None have worked. In 2024, after years of delays, Florida rescheduled his execution for June 24, 2025. Thomas Gudinas remains on death row at Union Correctional Institution. If executed, his death will bring closure to a case that's haunted Orlando for more than 30 years. His bottom came in a dark, empty lot, where a promising young woman lost her life, and he threw his own away. Richard Gerald Jordan holds a grim distinction. He is the longest-serving death row inmate in the United States. His crime was committed in 1976, and nearly 50 years later, he remains on Mississippi's death row, a relic of a case that has outlasted judges, governors, and even the courtroom where it began. On January 13, 1976, Jordan carried out a carefully planned kidnapping for ransom scheme in Gulfport, Mississippi. His target was Edna Marie Jordan, the wife of a wealthy banker, no relation to Richard. After abducting her at gunpoint, he called her husband and demanded $25,000 for her release. But before any ransom could be paid, Jordan shot her in the back of the head and buried her body in a wooded area. He then fled the state. Within days, he was arrested in Florida after police tracked him down through a series of phone calls. Jordan confessed to the murder and led authorities to the victim's body. He was sentenced to death in 1976, but his case quickly became one of the most complex in American death penalty history. Over the decades, his sentence was overturned and reinstated multiple times due to procedural errors, unconstitutional jury selection, and changes in Mississippi's death penalty laws. At one point, he was even resentenced to life without parole, but challenged it, seeking to be returned to death row rather than accept a sentence he believed was imposed unfairly. It was a legal paradox, a convicted killer fighting not to avoid execution, but to restore it, on principle. Throughout his time in prison, Jordan has become something of a case study in the dysfunction of capital punishment. His appeals have been heard in nearly every level of the judicial system. At one point, he was within days of execution. But delays, reviews, and litigation kept pushing the date further out. In 2025, Mississippi officials finally set a new execution date, June 25, 2025. Now in his 70s, Jordan has spent nearly half a century in solitary confinement. He's outlived many of his guards, outlasted generations of inmates. And yet, the end may finally be near. For Richard Gerald Jordan, the bottom wasn't the day he killed an innocent woman. It was the endless passage of time, the slow decay of decades spent waiting for a punishment the system never quite figured out how to deliver.